Cool. Okay. I think we've got a few more people joining us. Welcome along. Today we're going to be talking all about podcasting. My name's James Mulvany. I'm founder of Podcast.co. Obviously, feels a bit strange doing this remotely. I was kind of looking forward to coming and seeing you guys in Leeds. But here we go. We're going to get into it anyway. I've got going to be covering all sorts of stuff relating to podcasting today, particularly covering off how you can be using it for stakeholder engagement or for internal communications purposes. Morning to everyone who's connected. I'm guessing we're kind of getting there now. So without further ado, just going to switch into the presentation. Getting my head around this still. It's a bit strange, but cool. There we go. So let's get this kicking off. So my name's James Mulvany. I've been working with broadcasters since 2004. And my foray into podcasting was actually back in 2008 with Steve Ben. You'll probably know Steve, obviously Rebecca Ben's husband. So we ran a podcast for about a year in 2008. And that was kind of when I first ever touched the medium. Didn't do too well, but it was good fun and it was good experience, sort of experimenting with the medium. I hope to think that since then I've learned quite a bit. Obviously, we've been working recently with all kinds of clients, which I'll talk about later. I have two businesses, Podcast.co and Radio.co. So very, very confident and used to dealing with people broadcasting all kinds of content on the internet, ranging from talk to music to news and current affairs, through to sports, you name it, we've pretty much dealt with it. I also have my own podcast called Create, Reach, Inspire as well, which is great fun. And I use that to speak to all kinds of entrepreneurs, people doing interesting things with their businesses. Some episodes are recorded via audio, some are remote, and some are in person, and we actually film them as well. So let's dive into this. So today's presentation, first of all, I'm going to be giving you a bit of a history of podcasting, very, very brief history, looking at how it came about, and how it sort of developed over the last few years. Also looking at its current popularity and why we've seen such a huge growth in the medium over the last few years. Also answering the question, is it too late to start a podcast? This is something that we get asked a lot. Lots of people saying to us, there are too many other podcasts out there. Are we going to be able to get any breakthrough? Also, let's talk about podcasting versus other platforms, why there's a benefit to using podcasting compared to, say, Instagram or YouTube. And we're going to be going into how you can actually be using podcasting as a business tool for businesses and organizations. We're going to be looking at 3 different use cases. Then we're asking the question, what actually makes a good podcast? And then kind of going into a bit more detail, because I know you guys are particularly interested in using it for stakeholder communication. So how do you make an effective internal podcast? And ultimately as well, how can we help you achieve your goals? Finally, I want to take some of your questions at the end. So if you have any questions throughout this presentation, please put them in the YouTube comments box. Graham is watching, so Graham will be feeding back the questions to me at the end. And hopefully I'll be able to take some of your questions and try and make this as interactive as possible given the circumstances. I like having questions. It makes me think things on my feet. So if you have any questions about any of the content we're covering, please put them in the comments box. So without further ado, let's get stuck into today's presentation. So firstly, I wanted to talk about how podcasting came about. Obviously, this is not a new medium, but we have seen a lot of growth over the past few years. So the term podcasting was originally coined way back in 2003. So over 15 years ago now, came from the term iPod and broadcast, hence the term podcast. Podcasting came about because there's something called an RSS feed. And without boring you with all the technical details, this is basically a long, almost like a list of computer readable episodes. It's used for things like blogs. And then one day someone came up with the idea of attaching audio to each post. And hence podcasting was born. And before podcasting, it was kind of known as audio blogging. Apple then introduced podcasts to iTunes in 2005. So a couple of years after they sort of first came about, and they started to gain traction. But the thing is, in those days, it was really more the sort of tech enthusiasts who were the early adopters, because back in those days, before the invent of the iPhone and things, you'd need to download the file onto your computer. You then need to sort of sync it to your iPod via a cable connection. So it was kind of quite technical. It wasn't the most user-friendly of experiences. And it was certainly far cry away from, how podcasts are consumed nowadays. So it was around, but it took a few years before things really started kicking off. More recently, in 2012, Apple decided to then move it away from iTunes on your phone, and they actually introduced a dedicated podcasting app. So let's look at the present day. Obviously, I'm sure you guys are fully aware there's around 70% of people who are aware of the medium. If you went up to someone in the street, I think 5 years ago, and said, "What's a podcast?" you might get sort of some people said, "Yeah, I know what it is." There was a lot of people who just have no idea. Now, I think when it gets to the stage where, you're sort of speaking to friends and family and everyone's listening to podcasts, it's kind of hit the mainstream. In the UK, 1 in 8 people listen to podcasts each week. So we've seen this huge rise over the past few years. In the USA, there's about 37% of adults who are listening to podcasts week on week. And the good thing about these audiences is the statistics prove that they are captivated. It's not like radio where people will be tuning in, say, for 15 minutes. People are listening to podcasts at length, and they're listening to generally most of the episode. And the average consumption is around 6 hours per week for each person. So as marketers, as communicators, we've got a tremendous opportunity here to get long messages, long form content out to people, and kind of have some reassurance, at least, that they're being very engaged with, what we're communicating. Looking at the sort of popular categories, the top 4 are currently entertainment, comedy, talk, and news. So people go to podcasts because they want to be entertained, and they go to podcasts because they want information. Ultimately, they want to find out, they want to learn stuff. So when the term talk is kind of quite a broad context, a lot of those are interview-based podcasts. They could be about PR or marketing. They could be about entrepreneurship. They could be about health, all kinds of content and topics where it's talk-based content. Now, 1 in 5 homes have a smart speaker, which again presents more of an opportunity. And I think people are getting these smart speakers in more rooms in their homes. People have them now in their bedrooms as well as their kitchens. So people are using the smart speakers to do things like wake them up with the latest podcast. And it allows people to consume podcasts, when they're cooking, when they're doing housework, when they're working out, whatever. Smart speakers are really, really interesting tool to communicate with people. And currently, as it stands, half of listeners are still quite young, under 35. But people mainly listen when they're in home or in the car. So here's the reason why podcasting, I think, has grown over the sort of past 10 years. And especially we've seen so much growth in the past 2-3 years. Back in 2011, things like 4G came around, which means people can actually stream content more on demand. So you can have a quicker access to the content you want. And you're not relying so much on either downloading the file on your desktop, like I mentioned before, and transferring it to your computer. But you can be more spontaneous about stuff. If you're sat on public transport, you're sat on the bus, sat on the train, you want to suddenly listen to a podcast about, I don't know, something really specific. Well, you have access to that and you can download it and start listening straight away. By 2013, we were seeing wider spread smartphone ownership. Probably still around 2009, 10. Some people had smartphones, some people didn't. Nowadays, obviously, everyone in the population has got a smartphone. Also, things like bigger data allowances on mobile plans meant that more people were tuning in and they weren't worried about running out of data, so they could listen to more content, stream more video, listen to more podcasts, etc. Obviously, as I've just mentioned, smart speakers have had huge rise over the past 2-3 years. 2016 was when they first started making an appearance. Again, to begin with, smart speakers were just reserved really for the sort of tech enthusiasts, whereas nowadays, pretty much a common thing. They've replaced a lot of people's kitchen radios. So not only do they have access to streaming content, but also from sort of traditional radio stations, but they also have access to streaming their favorite podcasts as well. Now, interestingly, Apple have really dominated the podcasting space for the past sort of 15 years, and they still have a big chunk of the market. But sort of 2 years ago, around 2018, I think Spotify launched podcasts into their app, and obviously they have a huge user base as it is. So some people not only going to Spotify to choose to listen to music, and now also listening to podcasts through the Spotify app as well. Again, Spotify is very cross-platform. They have apps on Windows, Mac, iPhone, Android, Apple are really just locked into that ecosystem. E.g., you can't listen to a podcast if you have an Android phone on the Apple podcast directory. So Spotify have really got that benefit over Apple. But also Google as well have decided to pay more and more attention. And it's funny because Google have only just recently, I think it was about 2 months ago, launched podcast.google.com. So they now have a homepage where you can go, similar to the iTunes directory, and browse through podcasts. Again, they never had that before. But with these big players taking this seriously, it means that podcasts are being opened up to a much wider market than perhaps they were before. Apple have just recently launched their dedicated desktop app on Mac OS. Again, it's showing that Apple are taking this seriously. They're trying to encourage consumers to consume more content, and they're building dedicated facilities for them to do so. So here's the question. Is it too late to start a podcast? Well, current figures suggest that demand for podcasts actually exceeds supply. So if you think about this, there's around 900,000 active podcasts that are now on the Apple directory. And they announced this figure around about 2 months ago. However, if you think about this, there's 197 Americans listening. So that's 218 listeners for each podcast in the US alone. So this is still growing rapidly. 50,000 podcasts were actually added to the Apple directory just within February alone. So I'd say if you're thinking about starting a podcast, now is the time to get in, not next year. Because if you're growing at 50,000 a month, that's 600,000 a year. Currently, that figure is going to continue growing each month as well, as more and more companies are jumping on the bandwagon. More individuals are looking at creating podcasts, and also lots of production companies as well are taking to it as an alternative means to communicate. So, for example, one of my favorite examples from last summer, Gemma Collins, she wasn't even aware of what a podcast was. But then they launched a podcast with Gemma Collins, and by the end of the summer, she was like number 2 in the iTunes store. So it shows you the power of celebrity. But all of these media channels are taking this medium very, very seriously now, which means it is becoming more of a competitive space. But as I say, there's still lots of opportunity there for us as marketers. So why choose podcasting over another form of medium? Well, firstly, I think the main point to make is podcast listeners are very engaged. As I mentioned before, you've got a huge amount of time for people to actually consume the content. So if you think about YouTube, the average watch time is around 4 minutes. If you've got people scrolling through their feeds vigorously on Facebook, you've sometimes got a few seconds. And research has shown that Facebook sort of watch time of videos on Facebook is around 60 to 90 seconds. But people are tuning into podcasts for around 20 minutes or more. And 80% of listeners are tuning in for the entire episode. So there's a tremendous opportunity here to get people's attention and have them listening to content and have them listening to your message for a longer period of time. There's also far less competition. Now, I said earlier, yes, there's 900,000 podcasts on iTunes as it currently stands, and half American audience are listening. But if you look at this figure compared to the amount of YouTube accounts, the amount of Instagram users, blogs, Facebook pages, it's tiny. It's still right down there. YouTube is completely off the scale now. It's so hard to launch and grow a successful YouTube channel, but there's still a lot of opportunity in the podcasting space. So 3 different use cases for businesses and organizations, because I think there is a perception that podcasts, or certainly when we speak to a lot of clients who are using it for branding, for marketing, and for internal communications, it's a thing for kind of like 2 blokes down the pub having a laugh with their mates, but we're seeing more and more brands jumping on board and creating incredibly immersive experiences for their customers. And here are 3 different ways in which you can do that. Firstly, using it as an outreach tool or for lead generation. There's no reason you can't use podcasting for business development. Each episode could, say, target a different market or sector. And also, many entrepreneurs are using podcasts as a way to, effectively have meetings or try and get through to people, senior members of staff within organizations. So, generally speaking, if you go and say, I want to speak to the CEO, the answer is going to be no, right? If you say to the PA, I need to speak to the CEO because I want to interview him on a podcast, well, suddenly there's a big opportunity and there's an easier way of getting through to that person. And then ultimately, once you've interviewed them and had a conversation with them, you kind of build the rapport with that person. So there's lots and lots of entrepreneurs we're seeing now who are using this specifically as a tool for business development. And it's also great for, entrepreneurs or people with senior members of staff within organizations to sort of demonstrate, knowledge, grow authority, and ultimately level up their personal branding as well. So that's our first strategy, is outreach and lead generation. The second way companies and organizations are using podcasts are for educational purposes and engagement. So this is things like helping existing customers achieving their goals. It could be onboarding clients. It could be producing a series of podcasts around strategy which your clients will learn from. And ultimately as well, you can use it to showcase existing customers, talk about success stories. We have got a podcast at Podcast.co called Meet the Podcasters. It's a fantastic platform to showcase what some clients are doing, and also go out there, reach a further market, and see some interesting case studies of how people are using podcasting for different levels of success, and sort of kind of give it some examples to clients of what they can model and what they can learn from and do on their own podcast to get more listeners and gain more traction. So using it as a way to showcase testimonials or showcase success stories is another powerful option if you want to use it for engagement and education. And it's also about giving people a source of inspiration and knowledge, allowing people to communicate with you and giving this kind of sense of open and interesting discussion as well. And I think ultimately as well, finding guests is becoming quite easy. There are more experts, industry experts in every sector you could possibly imagine, who are now using the tool, like I said before, for personal branding. So you can actually speak to some really interesting people. And I'm going to touch on this a bit, finding guests, a little bit later, because we actually have a solution we've just launched for that. Finally, using podcasts for internal communications, which I understand is something the NHS are interested in doing. Ultimately, we need to be realistic. People don't always read emails or newsletters anymore. I think that's kind of quite common throughout many different sectors, especially within big organizations where there's hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of members of staff. Trying to communicate with them in an engaging way can be quite difficult, especially if you're sending them, paragraphs and paragraphs of text. Ultimately, leveraging podcasts allows for a good multi-channel engagement approach. I'm not saying you need to get rid of your emails or get rid of your newsletters, but some people prefer to listen to things rather than read things. And ultimately as well, one of the main benefits to podcasts, I think, is that you can consume them passively. So you don't have to necessarily be paying attention to it. You can have it on in the background whilst you're doing other work, like listening to the radio, really. So that's kind of got its own benefit. You don't have to have their attention like you would say a YouTube video. And it allows people to digest, large amount of information whilst they're doing something else ultimately. The other thing to touch on as well is, audio is the oldest form of communication. We've been telling each other stories, since way before we could write, we could create video or anything like that. So it's a really, really powerful and kind of personal way of communicating with people. So let's ask the question, what makes a good podcast? So I've put together a really simple formula, which we like to talk to any kind of customer who's creating any kind of podcast. This really applies across the board. Firstly, quality. Now, if you're recording a podcast now, I think you've got to make it sound at least reasonable. If you're recording on a built-in laptop, the microphone on a laptop built in, or if you're recording it on your phone, it's not going to sound great. And the problem with doing this is listeners will fatigue after listening to a podcast for, so long if you've got bad quality audio. So it doesn't have to be Hollywood, is what I like to say, but you at least need to ensure things like volume are consistent for each episode, especially if you've got people who are maybe tuning into one episode and listening to the next one. You don't want one that's really quiet, so they whack the speakers right up and the next one comes on and it's blasting out loud. So just little things like that, making sure that you've got a good post-production. You can make sure the levels are consistent, and ultimately the input you record in is at least of reasonable quality. Now, As I said earlier, it doesn't have to be Hollywood, right? So you're not going to have to go out and spend a fortune on a high-end recording studio. That's not what I'm saying here. But if you can invest in a good quality USB microphone, you could potentially send these to members of organization who you're going to have contributing to a podcast. They can plug it into their laptop, and the results are going to be 10 times better than if they're recording using a microphone that's built into their phone or their laptop. But it will make it so much more listenable and so much more consistent. The next is value, making sure each episode delivers something of value to the listener. So you need to be asking questions about, what you're actually trying to achieve with the podcast. Who are your actual audience? What are their kind of wants, needs, and desires? If the goal is education, you need to think about the series as a complete picture. So each episode should be clearly built on the previous, whilst having its own topic as well. And remember as well, I'm going to mention this later, but you can have series of podcasts. You don't have to commit to recording one every single week forever. You can build them in series. You could say, right, this series is going to be focusing around this topic. The next series is going to be covering a different topic. For podcasts centered around communication, you need to make sure that you're being as concise as you can in each episode and giving people the information they want without kind of going off on tangents or wasting too much time. And one of the things I've noticed with particularly interview-based podcasts, sometimes the guest can end up kind of going off on different tangents. The best thing to do ultimately is plan your interview if you're speaking to guests, but using editing as well to make sure that you're crunching them down and making them as concise as possible is a very, very valuable tool and effective method. If you just record something you're interviewing someone and you just allow them to sort of take up 2 hours just talking about this, that, and the other, and then just put that out as an episode without editing it down, it can end up not being as effective as if you spend a bit of time taking out the good bits and really making that story complete. And ultimately as well, if you're using it as a marketing tool, think about KPIs, what you want to achieve from the podcast and how you're going to measure that as well. Finally, consistency. This is really just giving people what they want when they want and managing people's expectations. So, have a regular schedule when you're releasing episodes. Don't say have one coming out on a Monday afternoon and then the next one comes out on a Thursday morning. Because ultimately people, especially if you're using it for an internal communications tool and people need to listen to the content to keep up to date with certain things, you need to really make sure that their kind of time is managed as much as yours. You could do a 5-minute daily briefing. We've got a lot of clients using daily briefings now. We tried doing one ourselves as well, talking about the latest podcasting headlines, just to kind of as an experiment for a few months. That worked really well. But again, if you're going to be committing to that, you need to make sure that you've got a strict schedule. Who's recording each day? What do they need to say? And making sure that, the workload ultimately for everyone is managed. As I mentioned before, using seasons to make sure, you're being realistic about what you actually want to achieve is very, very important. And having different seasons kind of gives you a bit of breathing space. So you could maybe put together a season of 6, 8, 10, 15, 20 episodes, whatever it might be, then have a bit of time between seasons to kind of reevaluate and think, okay, what worked, what didn't work. But seasons is a great tool. Don't just think when you commit to doing podcasting, it's something that you have to just do every single week forever and ever and ever. Because I know the idea of that is quite daunting, especially to a lot of businesses and organizations we speak to. And ultimately, finally, defining a clear format and running order. Then finally, authenticity, making sure that the content is authentic. No one wants to listen to someone speak in a monotone voice for 20 minutes. It's got to be personable to the listener. And ultimately, you've got to know who the listener is and speak to them in a way that they're going to understand and kind of relate to, I guess. I think the thing is with podcasts versus things like TV and radio, people see them as a more personal medium. And I think maybe this contributes to why they've been so successful as well. It's kind of like the people's media. It feels like you're having a one-on-one conversation with that person versus just being a viewer or a listener in the experience. And ultimately as well, I think people respond very well to podcasts because it doesn't feel too much just like it's a kind of hardcore message from the media, like newspapers just pushing headlines in people's faces. So ultimately, be real, know yourself, know your audience, and know your brand. Finally, we move on to authority and accuracy. Now, you need to make sure, especially if you're doing this as a business exercise or an organizational tool to sort of inform people, that what you're putting out ultimately has got to be right. You can't just be, you need to be vetting the content and making sure that, your content actually has got kind of clout to it and it comes from a credible source, etc. Make sure that you introduce guests appropriately and explain why they're there, explain what they're there to achieve. And, ultimately remember to delight, educate, and entertain. So finally, we move on to how to create an effective internal podcast. So here are the different types of internal podcasts that we see companies using and organizations using. Culture building, obviously really good. I think there's lots and lots of different creative ways you can use podcasts to engage and show off the culture you have. News and updates, just very much just like taking a newsletter and turning it into audio form, but it can work if it's done right. Learning and development, as I said earlier. Education, teaching people stuff in a series of episodes is really powerful. Engagement and retention of staff. Onboarding for new employees, in very similar kind of way to learning and development, but it can be a good tool to use for that. And ultimately as well, performance updates. How is an organization performing? What business objectives are being achieved? And that can be sent out to stakeholders or shareholders of a company. So firstly, we need to define the right strategy. What is the desired outcome or goal of the podcast? And also, what's the reason for using podcasting versus another medium? Is there a particular reason that you want to use podcasting, say, versus writing a newsletter? I think just answering these questions can be really useful from the early from the get-go of the early days. Ultimately as well, is this going to be a standalone production, or is it there to complement other forms of communication? Podcasting ultimately is a two-way street, so you need to make sure that you're as engaged as possible and getting feedback from people. But as well, just to touch on the standalone production, you need to make sure that if that's the case and you're not using this as a sort of way to complement other forms of communication, that people are actually consuming it and people are actually listening and tuning in and gaining from it. That's very, very important, I think. And ultimately, remember, people's time is valuable. So sometimes the entirety of each episode isn't going to be relevant for each person listening. You might have to section it off. And also remember that you don't have to have everything in one podcast. You can have multiple podcasts with different topics on each. I think, no one wants to be lectured, so you need to make sure that you're creating an engaging format. You need to make sure that this is going to be easily digestible and enjoyable, because ultimately I think there's definitely a perception that podcasts, going back to the top three categories, people want to be entertained. And to some extent, they want to have a good listening experience. So if you make it too dull and it's kind of too lectury or too sort of monotone, you're going to lose people's attention pretty quickly. I think you can easily split podcasts into different sections depending on requirements. So let's say you want to talk for 30 minutes. And again, people often say, how long should a podcast be? I think the answer to that, generally speaking, is between 20 and 40 minutes. Anything over 40 and it's a bit long for people to digest in one sitting. Anything less than 20, you have to be really concise about what you're saying. So I think 20 to 30 minutes is generally the sweet spot. But let's say you split it into 10-minute sections. So you might have 3 topics or 3 themes running throughout each episode, and you just split that down. You might talk about one theme for 20 minutes and another theme for 10, or 3 different themes for 10 minutes. But I ultimately create that format. Think about how you're going to be communicating and what it is you want to communicate, and how you can kind of make that into sort of bite-sized segments almost. Always start with an introduction. Remember, you can go back and record this after. You don't have to record the podcast in logical order, if that makes sense. Like I said before, if you're doing 3 different segments, maybe you're speaking to 3 different guests, well, you can record them in any order you want. And then you can record an introduction afterwards, basically saying, here's what you're going to learn in segment 1, here's what you're going to learn in segment 2, and just sort of see like this, like a kind of index or a contents page in a book. Ultimately, as well, there's something called show notes, and this is basically the description you get alongside each episode. You should try and make this as descriptive as possible. Most podcasts nowadays are also transcribed, which is basically the term used when you're turning text into audio. The way that things work now is you can actually do this automatically using artificial intelligence. It's not 100% accurate, but it's pretty good. So it does save a lot of time in terms of you don't need to manually type up your podcast. But again, having them turn into text can be really, really useful for repurposing information as well, because you can then turn that podcast into a blog post or a newsletter or a PDF, or you can take out quotes which then get posted onto social media. There's loads of stuff you can do with a podcast and use it for repurposing information. Just like anything, I think you need to be really organized when you're podcasting. It should be project managed. You need to treat it as seriously as you're treating anything else, whether you're creating a social media strategy or a marketing campaign. Have a plan, and make sure that everyone involved in the creation process or the coming up with the concept knows what their responsibility is, and try and get everything organized according to a time schedule. So we normally recommend working at least a week in advance. We have some clients who will work a couple of months in advance. It really varies depending on requirements, etc. But there's no harm, as I said before, in saying, we're just going to be committing to sort of 6 or 8 episodes for this season. Sometimes people will record those 8 episodes in one chunk, maybe say over a 2 or 3 week period. Well, they'll then be edited and then they can be scheduled then to go out according to sort of a release schedule. So effectively, the podcast season can be recorded in advance, just like any other season would be for something off Netflix. You don't have to be recording it as you're going. You can record it all in advance and push it out over time. And using a platform like Podcast.co makes that really straightforward as well. Ultimately, as well, it should be a collaborative process, I think. Speak to team, get some ideas, speak to people who are going to be featured on the podcast and kind of get a structure in place. I think involving people is a really powerful tool for kind of internal podcast businesses or organizations looking to use them, because it's a really good way of getting people involved. It's a great way to improve people's communication skills as well. But ultimately, you can use it to shine light on individual staff or different departments who have done good work, for example, and get, different colleagues involved. And also, I think it could be really good to help sort of build that sense of community, which I mentioned earlier, building culture and showing off how great your culture is within an organization, especially when you've got lots of people who are so far apart geographically that perhaps they don't speak to each other. Well, this is a really good way of getting everyone on the same page. So I think openness, honesty, and transparency are the keys to effective engagement. So once your podcast is actually ready to go, you'll need to make sure that people are aware about it. Now, whether you're doing this as a public exercise and it's being pushed out for anyone to listen to, or a private podcast, you can make this so it's embedded on an intranet or a portal. But ultimately, you need to make people aware of the fact it's now in existence, because people won't necessarily always know how to find it. And again, you might need to give some people guidance on how to listen, perhaps some people who aren't as technically savvy, etc. And, making sure you keep an eye on your analytics. So you're watching that people are engaged with the podcast and people are actually listening to the episodes that you created. And like I said before, you can create players, you can embed these within sort of password protected intranets, and make it simple for people to listen if they all have to do is hit a play button within a browser versus sort of downloading onto their phone, etc. So that can be a nice, simple way of integrating them to existing kind of content strategy. Finally, get feedback, making sure that your podcast is evolving. It doesn't have to be, set once and then just repeat it again and again and again. Each series you produce can be slightly different to the previous one. In taking on listeners' feedback is important, I think. Seeing about, did they get the right information from it? Do they think they have time to listen to a 30-minute thing every single week or every single month? Again, encouraging open discussion, comments, and ultimately, maybe even looking at doing surveys to make sure people who listen and sort of see what they're getting from it. And finally, I think just give them what they want to hear. I think ultimately, if people find 30 minutes too long and they want it to be 15, well, you'll have to look at sort of either splitting it up into 2 different episodes or sort of making changes to the content. So I don't want to pitch too long, so I'm just going to go very, very briefly into what we do and how we could potentially help. We have a hosting and distribution platform, which is self-service, which you can go and check out on Podcast.co. Really easy to use. You can upload your episodes and you can push them out to all the major channels. But we also offer full service production, right from concept through to recording. We operate a studio in Manchester right here. We also have studios in London, Amsterdam, New York, along with various partners who we work with to provide sort of production of studio facilities elsewhere. Once the podcast has been recorded, we then help with the editing process, marketing, release schedule, asset creation, and push it out to all the main platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google. We've got partnerships in place to make sure that your podcast can reach as many people as possible. Ultimately as well, like I said before, tracking people listening is very important. You need to make sure that people are actually listening to your podcast and engaged with what you're saying. So you can see all of this right from our dashboards. I mentioned earlier, booking guests for podcasts, or if you're looking to promote someone's personal brand, perhaps you've got a client or someone you're working with who wants to establish themselves as an expert within a field. We've just launched a matchmaking platform called matchmaker.fm. Very simple concept, and currently it's totally free to sign up and use, both for podcasters and for guests. You sign up, you can create a profile according to your area of expertise, put yourself into a different category, and there's about 1,500 users currently on the platform, which are growing every day. We're building a really great community of people who are looking to be featured on podcasts and podcasters who are looking for guests. If you want to get in touch, if you've got any questions for me, here's my virtual business card, which I've amazingly mocked up on the screen. My email is james@podcast.co. So now we're going to take some questions. And by the way, I'll put this deck up available as a PDF for anyone to watch. So let me see if I can just go back onto my, and we'll see what questions we've got. So first of all, really nice food. I'm guessing that's Rebecca. Hi, Rebecca. I hope you're doing well. What essential kit do you need to start a podcast? Okay, so I think the first thing to note is you don't need to go out and spend a fortune on, a big fancy studio. There are lots of USB microphones, which, as I think I mentioned earlier, you can plug into your computer, plug into your laptop. They sound 10 times better than recording on your phone or recording on the inbuilt, microphone on your computer. As you can see at the moment, sort of, if I can pull this in here, I've got a microphone which is like plugged in to an audio interface. So something like very similar to this will make your podcast sound so much better. And as I say, you won't run the risk of listener fatigue then. You could just go onto Amazon and type in USB microphone. There are tons of options available. If you want some specific recommendations, send me an email and I can send you some links. So question from Meg Rowley. What's the ideal length? Is there any insight to drop-off rates until after, say, 30 minutes? Well, according to the research, people listen for 70% of the episode. Now, obviously, some episodes we see are like 2 hours long. I think from kind of our observations and most of the clients we work with, the sort of sweet spot is generally between 30 and 40 minutes. 30 minutes is probably like the average. 20 to 30 minutes again is kind of like that's someone's commute in the morning, or that's someone's workout in the gym. So if you think about that and sort of treat time as, well, if someone's doing one task, they want to put a podcast in because they've got to listen to it, they can complete that they can kind of complete that task and also have listened to the whole podcast while they're doing that. Not going to have to listen to it in 2 sittings. I think that's kind of the benefit you're going to have to you can kind of achieve with having something that's around, say, 20 to 40 minutes. Once you go above 40 minutes, that's the kind of the case of you either got to have someone who's really, really engaged to listen to that whole thing, or either they have to maybe split it across 2 different listening sessions. Okay, so Paul, I love podcasts in my home life, mainly sports focus, and a lot of friends are similar. However, there is a switch towards those of more professional business nature. I mean, we see, we're working with clients such as Co-op, Samsung on a bigger scale, and also lots of smaller businesses as well. Things like solicitors, for example, who are using podcasts to shine light on cases that have just gone through court. It's a really good tool for them to sort of demonstrate their areas of expertise. Obviously, solicitors are good talkers by nature, so they kind of take into the medium really well. But certainly we're seeing more brands adopting it as a way of communicating to customers, to internally as well, to sort of talk about internally what's going on for stakeholder engagement, etc. So I think there is, there was a perception a few years ago that it was just people joking around with their mates, and a lot of podcasts indeed were kind of very homemade, whereas now we're seeing more and more brands, organizations, businesses jumping on the bandwagon and sort of taking advantage of the medium, because ultimately it's just like having a social media presence. Back in, say, the early 2000s, you wouldn't launch, people were still sort of launching businesses. They thought, do we really need a website? Now you definitely wouldn't launch a business and would not have a website. Same goes for social media. I think podcasts are still in the early days. It's kind of like Instagram was probably 10 years ago. Some businesses had Instagram accounts, a lot didn't. Nowadays, most businesses have got Instagram accounts, particularly if they're selling to consumers, but also in the B2B market as well. Question from Tim Oscroft: how slick do speaking voices and presenters need to be? Is there room for them to be conversational and a bit freeform? I mean, I'd say, yeah. I think podcasts, it goes back to what I was saying about making them personal and sort of having that kind of sort of intimate touch versus making it kind of too lectury or too formal. So I think you don't have to be a polished presenter. But what I would say is just making sure that, if you have it conversational, don't go off on too many tangents, and ultimately use editing to your advantage. Make sure once you've recorded a podcast, you can kind of crush it down into something and take out the best bits of those conversations versus just broadcasting the whole thing. Any insight when people listen at work versus on the commute? I think stat was in there on one slide. Maybe I missed it. Research has shown that about half of podcasts are listened to at home. Now, I'm guessing that's probably due to people listening while they're doing things like, hoovering, cleaning, cooking, or just whilst they're just sat relaxing, which is really interesting. There's a big chunk of people who listen to podcasts in the car as well. So commuting, I think about a quarter. And then the sort of other quarter is divided between like people being at work, people exercising, out and about, etc., etc. But I think still the big chunk of people listen whilst they're at home, according to research. Question from Paul, one for internal colleagues, because of work as well as seasons built around our various well-being and people plan strands. I think that's probably not a question for me. Vanessa Bassnett, do you have any tips on marketing a podcast or platform selection? I mean, I think ultimately the benefit of podcasts is that you're not sort of tied into one ecosystem. So obviously if you create a video, really YouTube's the platform that everyone's putting video out on now. So there is an opportunity to cast your net far and wide. If you're using it as a public, communications tool or a brand podcast, you want to get out to as many people as possible. We recommend, submitting it to as many of the platforms as you can, just to make it easy for people to find it. Discoverability is important, and also make it as cross-platform as possible. So it doesn't matter if someone's using Windows or Mac or iPhone or Android, they can tune and they can find you as easily as possible. And again, different people have got different preferences for how they want to consume podcasts. There's lots of sort of like smaller apps. So for example, like Pocket Casts and Breaker. Some people really like to use those versus the default sort of podcast app on the phone. So we'd recommend being on as many platforms as possible. But again, our service makes it super easy to submit to as many as possible. So what programs use for transcriptions? Again, our service does this automatically. It's built in using AI. Tools recommended for editing podcasts. Audio editing isn't something that's that simple to do. It's very similar to editing video. There's a free tool called Audacity, and there's plenty of tutorials out there on YouTube which will show you the basics of how to edit a podcast, how to sort of chop something together. But basically, Audacity, if you have a subscription to Adobe Creative Suite, Audition is the Adobe version of the audio editing software, GarageBand on Mac, Logic. Again, if you like, I can put together a list of these bits of software. I think there's probably some more information on that on our site. So, something needs my expert view. Best podcast, Adam Buxton or Athletico Mints. I like Adam Buxton. I've never heard of Athletico Mints, so I'm gonna have to go with Adam Buxton. And Rebecca says, Steve says hi, hi to you both. Hope you're doing well. Okay, so thanks very much. I think we've pretty much covered off all the questions there. Let me just have a look to see if we've got anything else. But I think we're all done. So thanks very much for everyone's time today. Hopefully this has been really useful to you. As I mentioned, I will export the presentation as a PDF and I'll send that over to your colleagues or upload it somewhere. And yeah, everyone have a good afternoon. Thanks very much for watching. And hopefully you find this useful. Take care.